Hello, Internet. I am Pastor Recoil, and welcome to my parish. Today is the 17th Sunday after Pentecost, and we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Pastor Recoil's Parish, where I talk about some things in the Bible that you may not have heard about in church, either because it's not quite appropriate for all audiences, or it just isn't something that's easy to talk about in a sermon. Today's readings for the 17th Sunday after Pentecost are Lamentations 1:1-6, Psalm 137, 2 Timothy 1:1-14, and Luke 17:5-10. Today, we're going to talk about suffering. Now, suffering isn't something we usually talk about in churches today, which is kind of odd. We claim to worship a God who was willing to suffer on behalf of humanity. Jesus suffered death, the Father suffered the death of his Son, and the Spirit suffers their suffering. But in the American church, we seem quite opposed to the idea of suffering. We do what I, inadvertently did last week, and we focus on getting through suffering by holding on to hope. But in the readings for this week, we're encouraged to acknowledge and mourn that thing that we are suffering. Now, we don't like that. In our culture, suffering is bad. It's not fun to suffer, that's for sure, and much of American life, especially white American life, is avoiding suffering. Or maybe more correctly, it's those with privilege avoiding suffering by passing that suffering along to people who don't have privilege, but that's a bigger discussion. We have lost our connection to suffering as a reality of our life that we will encounter. In the book of Lamentations, we have an account of someone dealing with suffering. It is pretty obviously, as the name implies, a lament by the prophet Jeremiah over the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians. Jeremiah knew this was coming. He prophesied about it. But when it happened, he still mourned. He lamented. He cries out, "The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to the festivals. All her gates are desolate, her priests groan, her young girls grieve, and her lot is bitter. Her foes have become the masters, her enemies prosper, because the Lord has made her suffer for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away captives before the foe." Psalm 137 is a different angle on the same event, as the psalmist mourns the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile to Babylon, and expresses every bit of anger that they have about it. Psalm 137 is raw emotion all the way to asking God, "O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock." These are absolute raw emotions. And I love these passages for that emotion because they give us permission to feel those same things. They give us permission to mourn whatever it is that's causing our suffering. They give us permission to be angry at our suffering. God invites us to acknowledge that we are suffering and not just push past it to whatever's next. Acknowledging our suffering is healthy, and it helps us to remember that our God is suffering these things along with us. God isn't just throwing hope and platitudes at us to try to make us feel better. In the mystery of the cross, Jesus suffers all the things that we suffer, the big things and the small things. This is why Paul, writing to Timothy near the end of his life, can say, Do not be ashamed then of the testimony about our Lord, or of me his prisoner, but join with me in suffering for the gospel. Paul isn't creating some persecution complex for Christians to always assume we're supposed to suffer, but he's inviting his friend to share in his suffering, and in doing so, share that suffering with our suffering Christ. Sharing suffering lessens its effect, and it builds a community that helps us through these times of suffering. When we suffer alongside one another, we can't help but bear some of their burden, and we learn to live together in love. Sometimes that's as easy as hearing someone's pain and saying, "Yeah, that thing sucks." Other times it's more involved, but at its core, we allow space to experience our suffering and the suffering of those around us, because it helps us heal, because it's what God does for us. And so we do the same thing for others. So if you want to see more content like this, check out the links to my right, or click the logo below my face to subscribe so you'll know when my next video comes out. Thank you for watching, and take the time this week to love your neighbor as yourself, especially if you don't like them all that much.